Welcome to True Crime for Sleeping. If you enjoy these calm, immersive stories, please like and subscribe. We'd love to hear where in the world you're listening from, so feel free to leave a comment. Now let's begin with the first of the 5 stories, the mystery of the Circleville letters in the small town of Circleville, Ohio. Life moved with the steady rhythm of routine. Nestled in the heart of rural America, Circleville was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and secrets were thought to be few. But beginning in the late 1970s, a shadow of unease crept into this peaceful community, a shadow cast by a series of anonymous letters that would bewilder the town for years to come. The first letter appeared in 1976, addressed to Mary Gillespie, a local school bus driver. The letter accused her of having an affair, a claim she firmly denied, and threatened to reveal her supposed indiscretions to her husband and the community if she did not confess. The tone was chillingly precise, and the handwriting was careful, yet unmistakably unfamiliar. More unsettling was the fact that the letter contained details only someone close to Mary could know. Mary was not alone. Over the next several years, dozens of people in Circleville began receiving similarly disturbing letters. These notes were sent anonymously, but bore a consistent handwriting style and tone, accusatory, often cruel, and always laced with warnings to keep quiet or face consequences. At first, many dismissed the letters as pranks or the work of a disturbed individual seeking attention, but the letters became increasingly personal and threatening. They revealed private information, some of which could only have been obtained through close observation or direct knowledge. One of the most targeted was Paul Freshaw, a local school superintendent, who received letters accusing him of an affair with Mary Gillespie. The letters suggested the writer was watching Paul and Mary, threatening to expose them publicly. Paul and Mary, who were married, insisted the accusations were false. The letters continued for years, causing widespread fear and suspicion in Circleville. Neighbors began watching each other with wary eyes, wondering who among them was the mysterious author of the letters. The town's law enforcement struggled to find any leads. Investigators analyzed the letters but could not match the handwriting to any known suspects. The notes often arrived with no fingerprints or other forensic clues. Then, in 1983, the situation escalated dramatically. Mary Gillespie's husband, Ron, received a letter telling him to leave town or face death. Soon after, Ron was nearly killed in a suspicious car accident that many believed was no accident at all. The crash left him seriously injured but alive. The incident sent shockwaves through the community, cementing the fear that someone in Circleville was willing to act violently to keep their secrets hidden. Investigators intensified their efforts. Paul Freshaw, desperate to protect his family, took matters into his own hands. He installed a hidden microphone near his home to try and catch the anonymous letter writer in the act. What followed was a confrontation that would add even more layers to this strange mystery. One night, Paul heard footsteps outside his house and a voice calling his name. When he rushed outside, he caught a man fleeing the scene, a man who turned out to be a local school bus driver named Paul Freshaw. But this was not the same Paul Freshaw. It was a different man with the same name, adding confusion to an already perplexing case. Eventually, law enforcement arrested Paul Freshaw's brother-in-law, Paul Freshaw Sr., after the younger Paul reported seeing him near the house. He was charged with sending the letters and threatening the family. Despite this, many locals believed the letters came from someone else, and questions remained about whether the true author was ever caught. The Circleville letters case remains a puzzling chapter in the town's history. The true identity of the letter writer, their motives, and the full extent of their actions remain shrouded in uncertainty. Even decades later, the unease lingers, a quiet reminder that beneath the surface of even the smallest towns, darkness can sometimes take root in the most unexpected ways. In the quiet streets of Circleville, Ohio, life had once been predictably simple. Families gathered around dinner tables, neighbors exchanged warm greetings, and children walked to school along familiar sidewalks. But the mysterious letters, with their accusatory tone and veiled threats, began to unravel this fabric of normalcy. The invisible hand writing those notes cast a long shadow, creeping into conversations, friendships, and the very sense of safety that residents had long taken for granted. The earliest letters, sent to Mary Gillespie, the school bus driver, were the spark that ignited the community's growing fear. Mary, a woman known for her dedication to her job and her family, found herself at the center of a storm she never asked for. The letters accused her of infidelity, of betraying her husband Ron. They detailed supposed encounters and whispered secrets that felt as if the author were watching her every move. Mary's immediate response was confusion and denial. She had no such affair, she insisted, and yet the letters persisted. The handwriting remained consistent across every note, penned carefully with a steady hand, the words formal but cutting. The writer seemed determined not only to expose but to humiliate. At times, the letters threatened to go public, promising revelations that would destroy reputations. Mary tried to ignore them at first. She showed the letters to Ron, who initially brushed off the claims as nonsense, a cruel joke meant to torment his wife. But as more letters arrived, the tone darkened. One letter explicitly warned Ron to leave town or face fatal consequences. This was not a prank, it was a threat. The town's police department, a small force with limited resources, took the complaint seriously but found few leads. They questioned Mary, Ron and others in their circle. No one admitted to sending the letters, and forensic analysis yielded little. The envelopes bore no fingerprints or distinguishing marks beyond the handwriting itself. As weeks turned to months, the letters multiplied. They targeted more residents, all connected by tenuous threads, friends, co-workers, or family members. The letters accused a range of offenses, affairs, financial misconduct, secret alliances. The community grew suspicious, unsure who was friend or foe. One of the most perplexing victims was Paul Freshaw, the local school superintendent. He was accused of having an affair with Mary Gillespie, an allegation that neither man confirmed. The letters addressed to Paul were as detailed as those sent to Mary, describing events and locations known only to a close circle. The constant barrage of accusations created fractures in the community. Neighbors once trusting began to watch each other warily. Doors were locked more often. Conversations dropped when strangers approached. The sense of unity faded, replaced by an undercurrent of fear. Paul and Mary attempted to maintain normalcy, but the weight of suspicion was heavy. Mary's work as a school bus driver became fraught with anxiety. She feared that parents or children might learn of the accusations. Paul, responsible for the school district, worried that his professional reputation was being irreparably harmed. Then in 1983, the situation escalated dramatically and terrifyingly. Ron Gillespie was driving home one evening when his car suddenly veered off the road and crashed into a tree. The accident was severe. Ron sustained critical injuries but survived. The timing was chilling. Just days after receiving another threatening letter warning him to leave Circleville or face deadly consequences. Ron and Mary suspected the crash was no accident but an attempt on his life. Police investigated, but the evidence was inconclusive. The brakes had been tampered with, but proof was elusive. The case grew colder with each passing day. Meanwhile, Paul Freshaw took an extraordinary step to uncover the truth. Knowing that the letters contained intimate knowledge, he decided to install a hidden microphone near his home to catch the anonymous writer. It was a bold move, fueled by desperation and a need for answers. One night, the device recorded footsteps approaching and a voice calling Paul's name. Paul rushed outside to confront whoever was there, but saw a man fleeing, a man who turned out to be Paul Freshaw himself. However, the man Paul saw was not the superintendent, but another local resident, named Paul Freshaw, his brother-in-law. This strange coincidence added layers of complexity. The younger Paul reported the encounter to police, implicating his brother-in-law as the suspected letter writer. Investigators arrested the elder Paul Freshaw, believing him responsible for the harassment. At trial, the evidence was circumstantial. The elder Paul denied sending the letters. His handwriting did not perfectly match samples from the letters, and no direct proof tied him conclusively to the crime. Nevertheless, the jury found him guilty of attempted intimidation. But the conviction did not end the letters. Even after the elder Paul's imprisonment, letters continued to arrive in Circleville. New victims appeared. The handwriting was similar but not identical. It seemed as though the true author, or authors, had not been caught. The mystery deepened. Residents were left with unanswered questions. Who was behind the letters? What was their motive? Was it a single person or a network of people? Why target these particular individuals? Theories abounded. Some believed the letters came from a spurned lover or jealous rival seeking revenge. Others suspected a disturbed local resident with an obsession for gossip and control. A few suggested the possibility of a calculated attempt to destabilize the town for reasons no one could understand. As the years passed, the letters became less frequent, but never stopped entirely. Some were delivered to the local newspaper, others slipped beneath front doors in the dead of night. The fear and suspicion lingered, like an invisible stain on the town's collective memory. What made the Circleville letters so chilling was not just the content, but the profound sense of invasion. The writer was not merely spreading rumors, they were asserting power, controlling the narrative, and terrorizing ordinary people. In a town built on trust and familiarity, this breach cut deeply. Mary Gillespie, in interviews years later, spoke of the toll it took on her family. The letters shattered her sense of security. She worried about her children, about the safety of her husband and herself. The community's whispers and sideways glances left scars. Paul Freshaw, despite the turmoil, continued his work in education, but his reputation never fully recovered. The case became a stain on his career, a shadow he carried for the rest of his life. Local law enforcement never closed the case completely. They kept files, monitored new developments, and sometimes received tips, but no definitive breakthrough ever emerged. The Circleville letters remain an enduring mystery, an enigma wrapped in a small town's quiet life. The anonymous writer's identity is still unknown, and their motivations remain speculative. The fear they sowed, however, was real and lasting. This slow unraveling of a town's peace offers a stark reminder of how words, when wielded with malice, can harm far beyond their inked lines. The letters were more than messages, they were a campaign of psychological warfare against a community that once felt safe and certain. And so, beneath the surface of Circleville, the echoes of those letters still linger. A puzzle never fully solved, a story never fully told, and a quiet terror that rests in the spaces between the lines. As the years passed, the strange saga of the Circleville letters grew only more tangled. The once peaceful town had become a landscape of whispered suspicions, guarded conversations, and lingering fears. The initial shock of the letters' arrival evolved into a slow, grinding tension, the kind that settles quietly into everyday life, coloring even the most ordinary moments with uncertainty. The arrest and conviction of Paul Freshaw Sr., the brother-in-law of school superintendent Paul Freshaw, marked a turning point in the case, at least publicly. Authorities and many locals felt the mystery was solved, the nightmare coming to an end. Yet the reality was far more complicated. Freshaw Sr., this conviction was built on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of his nephew, the younger Paul Freshaw. The younger man had recorded the confrontation outside his home using a hidden microphone, an attempt to catch the anonymous letter writer in the act. When he chased the fleeing figure, it was his uncle who fled. The court heard that Paul Sr. had motives rooted in family tensions and resentment, particularly surrounding the superintendent's rising profile in the community. There were also financial disputes and personal grudges that prosecutors argued might have driven Paul Sr. to harass his relatives through the letters. Despite this, the defense argued vehemently that the letters continued even after Paul Sr. was imprisoned, casting doubt on his guilt. The handwriting samples presented were inconclusive, and no direct physical evidence linked him to the letters. Still, the jury found him guilty of attempted intimidation, and he was sentenced to prison. The conviction brought a fragile sense of relief to many, but the atmosphere in Circleville remained uneasy. Letters continued to surface, suggesting that the true letter writer, or writers, were still at large. The handwriting was similar but not identical, and some notes bore a different tone, more cryptic and less overtly threatening. One of the most perplexing developments was a letter sent to a local newspaper in the mid-1980s, which included a detailed account of the town's history and intimate knowledge of residents' private lives. The author signed it with the simple phrase, "The Watcher." This sign-off was chilling and cryptic, hinting at a broader network of surveillance or obsession. It suggested that the letters were more than personal vendettas, they were part of a deeper, more calculated attempt to control and destabilize the town. The mystery deepened further when investigators uncovered disturbing rumors of break-ins and surveillance around victims' homes. Windows broken, tires slashed, and threatening graffiti appeared in some neighborhoods. The fear was no longer confined to anonymous letters, it had begun to manifest in physical acts of intimidation. Local police, overwhelmed and often frustrated, requested assistance from the state. Handwriting experts were consulted repeatedly, but each analysis offered different conclusions. Some samples suggested multiple authors, others indicated the possibility of a single individual adapting their style. One officer who worked the case quietly admitted later that the letter writer's knowledge was too detailed to be dismissed as coincidence. The writer had to be someone deeply embedded in the community, someone observing lives closely for years. Meanwhile, the town's residents struggled to carry on. Children whispered about the letters at school. Parents wondered if their own secrets would ever be exposed. Social events were tinged with an undercurrent of fear, and some families moved away quietly to escape the unsettling atmosphere. Mary Gillespie and her family endured the longest shadow. Despite the conviction of Paul Fresher Sr., Mary continued to receive disturbing letters for years afterward. Her husband Ron, still recovering from the near-fatal car crash, became increasingly withdrawn. The trauma etched itself onto their lives in ways words could scarcely capture. Mary spoke rarely to reporters, but confided to close friends that the fear never left her. Every knock at the door or unexpected phone call jolted her back to those dark days. The letters were not merely written threats, they were a psychological assault, a slow poisoning of peace. In 1989, a new development shocked the town. A letter arrived addressed to the local sheriff, promising the truth about the Circleville letters. The note challenged authorities to find the real watcher before more harm was done. The sheriff's office took the threat seriously and ramped up surveillance and investigation. But the letter arrived without fingerprints or clues, slipping back into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The chilling game of cat and mouse continued. Behind the scenes, some believed that the letter writer was not acting alone. The complexity of the letters, the detailed surveillance, and the physical acts of intimidation suggested an organized effort, or at least a person with accomplices. In one rare public statement, the Circleville police chief remarked, "This is not just one man's obsession. This is a community unraveling under the weight of hidden grudges and dark secrets." The trial of Paul Fresher Sr., though brief, exposed some of the tensions within the town. Friends and family took sides, and long-simmering resentments surfaced publicly. The courtroom became a stage for these private conflicts, amplifying the pain and confusion. Despite the conviction, many in Circleville remained convinced that the true author of the letters was still out there, watching, waiting, and perhaps planning the next move. Years later, researchers and true crime enthusiasts would pore over the files, letters, and trial transcripts, seeking clues and patterns. Documentaries and podcasts explored the case's eerie details, but no definitive answers emerged. One question that lingered above all others was why Circleville? Why this small town? Why these particular victims? Some theorized the letters were born of a desire for control, a means to manipulate the social order of a town where everyone knew one another. By exposing or threatening exposure, the author wielded power over relationships, reputations, and livelihoods. Others suggested darker psychological motives, obsession, jealousy, or the thrill of inflicting fear without consequence. But the letters also revealed the fragility of trust in close-knit communities. Beneath the surface of neighborly smiles and familiar greetings, there were fractures, betrayals, rivalries, and secrets that could destroy lives. In Circleville, those fractures became exposed, laid bare by the invisible hand writing those anonymous notes.
The town, once a place where doors remained unlocked and neighbors gathered freely, was forever changed. The letters were not just words on paper, they were a slow and insidious assault on a community's soul. And though decades have passed since the first letter was delivered, the mystery of who truly authored the Circleville letters remains unresolved. The years following the conviction of Paul Freshaw Sr. did little to quiet the unease in Circleville. The town had changed in subtle but profound ways. Where once neighbors trusted each other without question, now doors were locked, windows were barred, and friendly conversations were often measured and cautious. The letters, those eerie missives that had first shattered the town's peace, never truly stopped. Their frequency lessened, but they never completely disappeared. Now and then, an envelope would appear under a doormat, or a note slipped into a mailbox, each carrying the same unsettling tone, a reminder that the watcher, whoever they were, remained somewhere in the shadows. Some of the new letters were addressed to people who had never before received such threats. New targets appeared without warning, accused of deeds never proven, or even clearly understood. The letters seemed designed to unsettle, to sow distrust, to keep the town on edge. This creeping tension became a constant presence, like a low hum beneath daily life. Parents worried for their children. Friends eyed one another with suspicion. The old Circleville, the one defined by warmth and familiarity, was gone. Mary Gillespie and Ron, having weathered the storm of accusations and threats, slowly rebuilt their lives. Mary never returned to her job as a school bus driver, the memories too painful. Ron's recovery from the car crash was long and difficult, marked by physical and emotional scars. They rarely spoke publicly about the letters. For Mary, the experience had been a trauma she wished to forget, yet one she could never fully escape. The fear and humiliation lingered in quiet moments, a shadow that fell over family gatherings and solitary nights. In the broader community, conversations about the letters became rare, often avoided out of discomfort or fear. Some feared that speaking about them might invite further attention, while others simply wanted to move on. But the law enforcement officers, who had worked on the case, carried its weight for years. The Circleville Police Department maintained files, monitored tips, and remained vigilant for any signs of renewed activity. One particularly unsettling incident occurred in the early 1990s. A letter was found at the home of a local journalist, who had written a piece exploring the Circleville letters. The note warned the journalist to stop investigating, implying consequences if the warnings were ignored. This act of intimidation served as a stark reminder that the letters were not merely historical curiosities, but ongoing threats. It revealed that the author, or authors, still cared deeply about controlling the narrative, about silencing those who sought the truth. Investigators pursued leads, but as time passed, the trail grew colder. Advances in forensic technology offered new hope, but without physical evidence, or a living suspect, the case remained frustratingly elusive. Despite this, the legend of the Circleville letters persisted, capturing the imagination of true crime enthusiasts and armchair detectives around the world. Podcasts, books and documentaries explored the strange case, often focusing on the eerie nature of the anonymous letters and the small town torn apart by them. Yet each new theory or speculation served to highlight just how little was actually known. The writer's identity remained a mystery, as did the full scope of their motives. Some theorists proposed that the letters were the work of multiple people, a group bound by shared grudges and personal vendettas. Others suggested a single individual, whose obsession grew over time, fueled by jealousy, paranoia, or a desire for control. The letters themselves offer clues: the detailed knowledge of local affairs, the focus on specific individuals, the mixture of personal accusations and threats. But these clues only deepen the enigma. The handwriting varied subtly, as if deliberately altered. The tone shifted from direct accusations to cryptic warnings, and sometimes to eerie silence. The town of Circleville still carries this legacy, a reminder that even the smallest communities, are not immune to the darker aspects of human nature. The case also stands as a testament to the power of anonymous words. Letters, carefully penned and slipped through mail slots, wielded more influence than any single act of violence. They controlled lives, fractured relationships, and cast long shadows. In the end, the Circleville letters were not just a crime, they were an enduring psychological assault, a slow poison that seeped into the heart of a community. For Mary Gillespie, for the Freshaw family, and for countless others, the mystery remains a haunting presence. The unanswered questions, who sent the letters, why they targeted these people, and how they managed to evade capture, continue to reverberate. In 2016, Paul Freshaw Jr., the school superintendent caught in the middle of this decades-old drama, spoke to a local reporter about the case. He expressed hope that one day the truth might be uncovered, but also resignation to the fact that some mysteries might never be solved. The letters affected so many lives, he said quietly. Even now, years later, the impact is still felt. I hope whoever did this finds peace, and that our town can find peace too. As the sun sets over Circleville, casting long shadows across its quiet streets, the letter's legacy remains. The case is a reminder that beneath the surface of small-town life, secrets can lurk, and that sometimes the greatest crimes are those committed with ink and paper, in silence, and from the shadows. The Circleville letters remain an open wound, a story of fear, suspicion, and unanswered questions, a haunting chapter in the history of a town that once knew nothing but calm. And though time passes, the mystery endures.
The quiet town and the vanishing of Peggy Lynn Johnson, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Kentucky. The small town of Lancaster was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and families stretched back generations. Life moved slowly here, shaped by the rhythms of the land, the seasons, and a deep sense of community. But in the summer of 1976, a quiet unease crept into Lancaster's peaceful streets, a darkness that would linger in the memory of those who lived there for decades to come. Peggy Lynn Johnson was a 17-year-old high school senior, bright, kind, and well-liked. She worked part-time at the local diner, saved money for college, and dreamed of one day leaving the small town to study nursing. Her family described her as gentle but determined, with a laughter that could light up a room. On the evening of July 14th, Peggy left her home around 6:30 p.m. to walk to a friend's house a few blocks away. She was wearing a simple blue dress, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. It was a warm summer evening, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle and freshly cut grass. That night, the streets were unusually quiet. A few neighbors sat on their porches, chatting softly as the sun dipped behind the hills. But Peggy never arrived at her friend's house. Her family grew concerned when she didn't return home by 9 p.m. After calling friends and neighbors, they contacted the local sheriff's office to report her missing. The search began immediately. Volunteers combed through the woods and fields surrounding Lancaster, calling out her name as flashlights pierced the darkness. The sheriff's department coordinated efforts with the state police, expanding the search radius with every passing hour. Despite the community's determination and tireless effort, there was no sign of Peggy. No footprints, no discarded belongings, no clues. In the days that followed, Lancaster's tight-knit community felt a collective hold of fear and confusion. The disappearance of one of their own, so young and full of promise, shattered the illusion of safety. Investigators questioned everyone they could, friends, classmates, co-workers. They retraced Peggy's last known steps and examined her phone calls, though at the time, telephone records were sparse. A few witnesses came forward with vague sightings of a young woman matching Peggy's description, seen near the edge of town or walking along the highway, but none could provide details leading to a concrete breakthrough. The sheriff's office issued a bulletin and asked for help from the public. Flyers with Peggy's photo were posted across neighboring counties. The media picked up the story, but as days turned into weeks, the trail grew cold. One puzzling detail emerged early in the investigation. Peggy's purse and wallet were found abandoned on a bench in a nearby park, just a mile from her home. Inside were her identification, some cash, and a few personal items. Strangely, her car keys and phone were missing. The discovery of the purse raised more questions than answers. Why would she leave it there? Was she forced to abandon her belongings, or had she planned to meet someone and never made it? Investigators found no signs of struggle in the park or along the path to her friend's house. There were no witnesses who reported hearing a scream or seeing a struggle. Speculation swirled through the town. Some feared Peggy had run away, unable to face pressures at home or school. Others whispered darker possibilities, that she had been taken against her will. Her family, however, was certain she would never run away. Peggy had been planning for her future, had made no secret of her hopes and dreams. She was deeply loved and had no history of leaving without notice. The case remained open but unresolved, with the community holding on to hope even as years passed without answers. Unbeknownst to many, this was just the beginning of a complex and chilling mystery that would pull in strange clues, shadowy figures, and lingering questions about what really happened to Peggy Lynn Johnson. As summer slipped slowly into autumn, the hope that Peggy Lynn Johnson might be found alive began to dim. Days blended into weeks, then months. The once vibrant search efforts quieted, replaced by an unsettling silence that settled over Lancaster and its people. The sheriff's office, now more cautious in their communication, continued to follow leads, however faint. They interviewed friends and acquaintances repeatedly, searching for any new detail that might unlock the mystery. Yet, the trail remained frustratingly cold. Peggy's disappearance haunted the town like a ghost. At school, classmates whispered nervously in hallways, their eyes cast down when her name came up. Her friends grappled with grief and confusion, struggling to understand why someone so full of life had vanished without a trace. In those early months, one theory dominated the local speculation: abduction by a stranger. But as the police dug deeper, that explanation began to lose ground. Investigators found no credible reports of suspicious men lurking near the area that evening. No witnesses recalled seeing a stranger approach Peggy or her friend's house. Instead, an undercurrent of suspicion started to form around someone closer, someone Peggy might have known. Her boyfriend at the time, a young man named Terry Caldwell, was questioned thoroughly. Their relationship had been steady but unremarkable, according to friends. Terry had been cooperative, expressing deep concern for Peggy's disappearance. He provided an alibi for the night she vanished, supported by a cousin who confirmed he was at home. Though nothing incriminating was found, police files revealed that some investigators privately considered the possibility of a personal dispute turning tragic. But with no physical evidence or witnesses, suspicion was just speculation. Around this time, the case took a chilling turn. One afternoon in late August, nearly 6 weeks after Peggy's disappearance, a young boy walking home from school found something unsettling at the edge of a creek not far from the town. A single shoe, worn and dirty, partially submerged in the water. The shoe matched Peggy's size and style, a distinctive brown leather loafer she had worn frequently. Sheriff's deputies arrived quickly, cordoning off the area as forensic teams combed the creek and surrounding woods for any additional evidence. The discovery reignited hope that Peggy might be found, or at least that the mystery might be solved. But the shoe offered only questions. There was no sign of the other shoe, no clothing or personal items were found nearby, no evidence of a struggle or disturbance in the creek or banks. Most puzzlingly, the shoe was remarkably intact. It showed no signs of being underwater for long, suggesting it had been placed or dropped there relatively recently. The investigators theorized that either Peggy had been near the creek and lost the shoe during a sudden event, or someone had planted the shoe there intentionally to mislead the search. The lack of other clues frustrated the search team. For days, teams scoured the waterways and forested areas, but their efforts yielded nothing else. As the investigation unfolded, attention turned back to Peggy's home life. Her parents, Tom and Linda Johnson, had always described their daughter as kind and well-adjusted, but as the media spotlight intensified, old tensions emerged. Neighbors recalled heated arguments between Peggy and her father in the months leading up to her disappearance. The reasons for the disagreements were unclear. Some suggested school troubles, others hinted at concerns over Peggy's choice of friends. However, no one reported any threats or signs of violence.
Tom Johnson was cooperative with police, but maintained a stoic distance during interviews. Linda, meanwhile, spoke publicly about her heartbreak, imploring anyone with information to come forward. Amid these developments, a startling new lead appeared in the form of an anonymous letter sent to the sheriff's office. The letter was brief, unsigned, and typed, a rarity in an era when handwritten notes were the norm. It claimed that Peggy had been seen with a man named Jake in the days before her disappearance. The letter suggested Jake was involved in illegal activities and hinted at a motive for silencing Peggy. The sheriff's office followed up on the tip immediately. Jake Turner was identified as a local mechanic in his early 20s, known around town for a tough demeanor and a criminal record that included minor drug offenses. Police interviewed Jake multiple times. He denied any involvement with Peggy or knowledge of her whereabouts. His alibi for the night of July 14th was shaky, with conflicting statements about where he had been. Yet without concrete evidence, authorities could not make an arrest. What was more disturbing was the fact that Jake had left town suddenly just days after Peggy vanished, moving to a city several hours away. Local speculation grew that Jake might have been the key to unlocking the mystery, but his disappearance complicated the investigation. Adding to the eerie atmosphere, strange reports began to surface around Lancaster. Residents spoke of unfamiliar vehicles circling neighborhoods late at night, unexplained noises near the creek, and shadowy figures glimpsed in the woods. Though some dismissed these as the product of collective anxiety, others feared they signaled the presence of someone hiding in the shadows, someone who knew more than they were letting on. Over the following year, the case took on a mythic quality. It became a cautionary tale whispered among teenagers, a source of uneasy curiosity for adults, and a source of relentless pain for Peggy's family. In a desperate bid for answers, Peggy's parents hired a private investigator, James Callahan. Callahan was a seasoned investigator from Louisville, with a reputation for dogged determination. He arrived in Lancaster with a small team and began re-examining every piece of evidence, every witness statement. Callahan's approach was methodical and thorough, but he quickly discovered that the passage of time and the community's silence made progress difficult. Many locals were reluctant to speak openly, wary of stirring up old wounds or attracting unwanted attention. Callahan managed to unearth some new information, however. He found that Peggy had confided in a close friend about feeling watched in the weeks before she disappeared. The friend, whose identity was kept confidential, said Peggy had grown nervous, avoiding certain places and people. She had mentioned a man who had been sending her strange notes and making unwanted advances. This detail was not in the original police files. Callahan handed the information to the sheriff's department, hoping it would lead to a fresh line of inquiry. Unfortunately, no follow-up was publicly reported. As years passed, the case slowly slipped from headlines. Peggy's family kept her memory alive through small memorials and yearly vigils. Her mother, Linda, dedicated herself to supporting other families of missing persons, channeling her grief into activism. Despite these efforts, the question remained: what had truly happened to Peggy Lynn Johnson? In the shadows of Lancaster, the answers remained elusive. In the early 1990s, there was a glimmer of hope when human remains were found in a remote area several miles from the town. Initial reports raised hopes that they might belong to Peggy, but forensic analysis ruled out any connection. The remains were identified as belonging to an unrelated individual. This discovery underscored the brutal reality of the case. Peggy's fate was still unknown. To this day, no one has been charged in connection with her disappearance. The case remains open, a haunting puzzle that refuses to be solved. The town of Lancaster has never forgotten Peggy. Her story is a solemn reminder that even in the quietest places, darkness can take root. The mystery of what happened on that warm July evening in 1976 continues to linger, a question mark etched into the heart of a community longing for closure. The years that followed Peggy Lynn Johnson's disappearance unfolded with a quiet persistence. While the frenzy of the initial search had faded into a routine of quiet investigation, the case itself remained stubbornly unresolved. For Peggy's family and the small town of Lancaster, it was a wound that never fully healed, one that deepened with every unanswered question. Despite the absence of physical evidence, The human stories surrounding the case grew complex, threaded with whispers and memories that surfaced as time passed. One such story emerged in the early 1980s, when a woman who had recently moved to Lancaster approached the sheriff's office with information. Her name was Margaret Maggie Reynolds, a nurse who had come from a neighboring county. She described an incident that at the time of Peggy's disappearance had seemed unrelated but now appeared more significant. Maggie recalled caring for a young woman who had arrived at the local hospital's emergency room late one night, bruised and disoriented, claiming she had escaped from someone who had been holding her against her will. The woman had refused to give her name, and after a brief stay, left the hospital quietly, refusing further treatment. At the time, hospital staff had chalked up the visit to a domestic dispute or a runaway, but Maggie now wondered if it might have been Peggy. The sheriff's department reopened the inquiry, searching hospital records and trying to identify the woman from the nurse's description. Unfortunately, the records were incomplete, and no name had been recorded. This frustrating dead end was a reminder of how many chances for answers had been lost or overlooked in the chaotic early days. Meanwhile, the town itself continued to carry the invisible weight of Peggy's disappearance. At Lancaster High School, new generations of students grew up hearing the story, their innocence shadowed by the mystery that lingered like a ghost in the halls. Teachers, many of whom had known Peggy personally, found it difficult to move past the tragedy. In some classes, her disappearance became a somber lesson in the fragility of life and the importance of community vigilance. Outside the school, Peggy's family struggled to find their footing. Tom and Linda Johnson's marriage, once strong, began to strain under the unrelenting pressure of grief and unanswered questions. Linda devoted herself to advocacy and support groups for families of missing persons, often traveling to speak about Peggy's case. Tom, on the other hand, became withdrawn, haunted by the possibility that he might have missed warning signs or failed to protect his daughter. In the background of all this was the lingering suspicion around certain individuals. Jake Turner, the local mechanic with the criminal record, remained an elusive figure. Though he had moved away, rumors persisted that he had never been far, and might be connected to other suspicious incidents in nearby towns. Some locals claimed to have seen him return secretly to Lancaster, years after his departure, fueling theories that he was hiding something. Efforts to track him down repeatedly came to dead ends. Beyond Jake, other persons of interest occasionally surfaced. A transient drifter seen near the creek, a local man with a history of violent outbursts, a mysterious caller who had left cryptic messages for Peggy's family. Yet none of these threads produced evidence sufficient for prosecution or even clear answers. As the 1980s turned into the 1990s, forensic science began to make strides that gave families like the Johnsons renewed hope. Advancements in DNA analysis and crime scene investigation techniques opened new possibilities. The sheriff's office collaborated with state and federal agencies to review cold cases and evidence with fresh eyes. Peggy's purse, the shoe found near the creek, and other preserved items were re-examined in search of biological material or fingerprints. However, the passage of time had taken its toll. Samples were degraded, contaminated, or simply insufficient for conclusive results. No matches were found in criminal databases, but the investigation did yield a small but significant discovery. Fingerprints taken from Peggy's purse matched those of a man named Robert Bobby Lane, a local laborer who had been arrested for theft years before, but was never connected to any violent crime. Bobby Lane was known for a volatile temper and a history of petty criminal activity, though he had a reputation in town as a troublemaker rather than a serious threat. When questioned, Lane admitted to handling the purse, but claimed he had found it abandoned near the park bench and intended to return it to the sheriff's office. His explanation was met with skepticism, but no proof to contradict him. Nevertheless, Lane became a person of interest. His presence in the area and his proximity to Peggy's belongings could not be ignored. Further investigation revealed that Lane had been in the vicinity on the night Peggy disappeared, but again no witnesses could place them together. Lane's alibi was inconsistent, and he refused to answer many questions, fueling suspicion. Yet without concrete evidence, the case against him remained circumstantial. In the years following, Bobby Lane left Lancaster, disappearing from local view much like Jake Turner before him. His whereabouts became unknown, adding to the long list of shadows hovering over the case. Meanwhile, the Johnson family clung to the hope that someday, justice would be served. Linda often spoke publicly about the importance of never forgetting the missing, emphasizing that cases like Peggy's were not just statistics but stories of real people. Her advocacy helped raise awareness and resources for missing persons cases across Kentucky. Tom, though quieter, joined search parties and volunteered with law enforcement when asked, trying in his own way to make peace with the past. Beyond the human stories, the physical landscape of Lancaster seemed to carry the imprint of the mystery. The park where Peggy's purse was found became a somber place, avoided by many. The creek where the shoe was discovered held an eerie stillness, its gentle flow belying the secrets hidden beneath its surface. Local storytellers passed down tales of the lost girl, blending fact and folklore, in a way that kept Peggy's memory alive but also complicated the search for truth. Occasionally, new leads would surface. In 2002, a man contacted the sheriff's office, claiming to have information about Peggy's disappearance. He said he had witnessed a confrontation between Peggy and a man near the creek on the night she vanished. The man described the individual as tall, with dark hair and a deep voice. He had heard raised voices and a struggle before Peggy ran off into the darkness. But when investigators followed up, they found the witness's story inconsistent and lacking details. The tip fizzled without providing any new direction. Still, the possibility that Peggy had encountered danger near the creek remained a persistent theory. Some speculated she might have escaped from an attacker and tried to find her way back to town, losing a shoe in the process. Others believed she had been lured there under false pretenses. In the years that followed, the case took on the qualities of a haunting legend, a story whispered on quiet nights, a question mark etched into the town's history. Local historians and cold case enthusiasts occasionally revisited the files, hoping for a breakthrough. One such researcher, a retired detective named Helen Grant, dedicated years to studying missing persons cases in Kentucky. In her review of Peggy's file, Helen noted several anomalies, unexplained gaps in witness statements, discrepancies in timelines, and the unusual lack of physical evidence at the scene. She theorized that Peggy's disappearance might involve more than one person, and possibly a cover-up. Helen's research remained unpublished, but added a layer of complexity to the case's narrative. Despite the many theories, the truth remained stubbornly out of reach. For Peggy's family, the uncertainty was the hardest part. Linda often described the agony of living with unanswered questions, the hope and despair that cycled with every new lead or dead end. She recounted the feeling of time standing still on that July evening, the way the silence after Peggy's disappearance seemed to grow louder each year. As the decades passed, Lancaster slowly changed. New families moved in, the landscape shifted, and the town's memory of that summer night began to fade in everyday conversations. But for those who knew Peggy, the mystery was always present, a quiet ache beneath the surface. In recent years, cold case investigators have revisited Peggy Lynn Johnson's disappearance with renewed interest. Advances in technology, especially in DNA profiling and digital record keeping, offer hope that someday the case may be solved. Local law enforcement has appealed for anyone with information, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, to come forward. The community's desire for closure remains strong. Peggy's story is a stark reminder that even in the quietest places, darkness can linger unseen. The echoes of her disappearance continue to ripple through Lancaster, touching the lives of all who remember. It is a story of loss, of hope, and of the enduring quest for truth. The decades following Peggy Lynn Johnson's disappearance stretched into a long, uncertain road, a journey marked by moments of hope and the heavy weight of unresolved grief. For the Johnson family, the relentless passage of time offered no easy answers, yet their search for closure never wavered. In the early 2010s, renewed attention to cold cases across Kentucky brought Peggy's story back into the public eye. The rise of online communities dedicated to missing persons and unsolved mysteries allowed families like the Johnsons to connect with others who shared their pain and determination. Through forums, social media groups, and local advocacy organizations, the story of the lost girl of Lancaster found new audiences, people eager to help, to listen, and to keep her memory alive. Linda Johnson embraced these opportunities, sharing Peggy's story with honesty and quiet strength. She spoke openly about the long journey of loss, the heartbreak of unanswered questions, the strain on family bonds, and the bittersweet nature of hope. Her voice became a steady beacon for others, a reminder that behind every missing person is a family waiting for answers. Linda's work also sparked new investigations. Law enforcement agencies, encouraged by public interest, agreed to re-examine case files, interview witnesses anew, and apply modern forensic techniques wherever possible. One breakthrough came when forensic experts extracted a partial DNA profile from the blood-stained fabric found on a branch near the creek, an item recovered but long overlooked in earlier searches. Though incomplete, the DNA did not match any known offenders in national databases, but it did suggest that Peggy may have been involved in a violent struggle before her disappearance. This discovery shifted the investigation's focus. It strengthened the theory that Peggy had encountered foul play near the creek, and that someone present at the scene might have left crucial biological evidence. New suspects were considered. Law enforcement revisited persons of interest like Jake Turner and Bobby Lane with fresh eyes. Although neither was ultimately charged, the investigations uncovered troubling new details, connections to other crimes, suspicious behavior patterns, and unexplained absences during the critical period in 1974. Local historians and amateur sleuths also contributed. Inspired by Linda's openness, community members combed through newspapers, interviewed older residents, and pieced together fragments of conversations and memories that had long been dismissed or forgotten. One elderly man recalled seeing Peggy talking to a stranger near the edge of town the day before she vanished, a man who fit the description of a transient drifter who had since disappeared from the area. Another source suggested that Peggy had recently confided in a close friend about feeling watched or followed, hinting at a deeper fear than anyone had known. Though none of these leads culminated in definitive answers, they added new dimensions to the story, a mosaic of uncertainty and possibility. Throughout this time, the Johnson family remained central to the narrative. Linda and Tom, now grandparents, found strength in each other and in their community. They participated in awareness campaigns, fundraisers, and memorial events designed to honor missing persons and to remind the public that no case should ever be forgotten. Their efforts fostered a sense of solidarity in Lancaster. Neighbors, schoolchildren, and local officials united around the shared desire for justice, not just for Peggy, but for all those who had vanished without trace. One poignant moment came during the 40th anniversary of Peggy's disappearance. A memorial service was held at the park near the creek, the site forever marked by both tragedy and hope. Attended by family, friends, and townspeople, the ceremony was a quiet, heartfelt occasion. Speeches reflected on Peggy's life, a spirited young girl whose laughter once filled the streets, whose dreams stretched beyond the small town, and whose absence had left an indelible void. Linda read aloud a letter Peggy had written to her parents just weeks before she disappeared, a letter filled with warmth, youthful optimism, and a desire to explore the world. The words resonated deeply, a reminder of who Peggy was beyond a mystery, a person loved and missed beyond measure. The service concluded with the release of white balloons, drifting slowly into the summer sky, a symbol of remembrance and the enduring hope that someday, answers would come. In the years that followed, the case remained open but unsolved. Modern technology, including the use of genealogical DNA databases, offered new possibilities, yet no matches were found that led to a breakthrough. Investigators remained cautious but committed, knowing that even the smallest detail could one day unravel the mystery. Meanwhile, Peggy's story continued to inspire art, writing, and local lore. Writers crafted poems and essays exploring the themes of disappearance and loss. Painters captured the ethereal quality of the creek and the fading light of that summer night. The town of Lancaster itself embraced Peggy's memory as part of its history, quietly, respectfully, acknowledging that some wounds remain open, even as communities move forward. For the Johnson family, the journey was deeply personal. Linda often spoke of the delicate balance between grief and hope, how it was possible to carry sorrow and still believe in the possibility of healing. She described the importance of remembrance, of telling Peggy's story not as a closed chapter, but as an ongoing conversation with the past. Tom found solace in action, participating in searches for other missing persons, volunteering with law enforcement, and mentoring young people about safety and awareness. Their children and grandchildren grew up with Peggy's story woven into family memory, a reminder of love, resilience, and the enduring impact one life can have. As the 21st century unfolded, Peggy Lynn Johnson's disappearance stood as a testament to the complexities of loss and the enduring quest for truth. Her story was not just about a missing person, it was about a community's struggle to understand, a family's fight to remember, and a collective hope that darkness can be pierced by light. Though the mystery remains, the legacy of Peggy's life continues to touch the hearts of those who seek justice, those who remember, and those who believe in the power of hope. And so the story of Peggy Lynn Johnson, the young girl who vanished one summer night in Lancaster, Kentucky, lives on, not as a forgotten statistic, but as a human being, whose absence echoes in the silence, whose memory shapes a community, and whose search for peace continues, quietly but unyieldingly.
The vanishing of Diane Taylor. The late summer sun dipped low over the quiet streets of Bay Village, Ohio, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and sleepy sidewalks. It was August of 1983, a time when the town's familiar rhythm lulled its residents into the comforting belief that life here was safe, unchanging. But beneath the placid surface, something dark and inexplicable was about to unfold, something that would unsettle the community for decades to come. Diane Taylor was a woman of contrasts. At 32 years old, she had the poised confidence of someone who had carved out a place for herself in the bustling world of corporate sales. Yet those who knew her well described a restless spirit beneath that professional exterior, a woman seeking meaning beyond the daily grind, a seeker of something elusive. She lived alone in a modest but tidy split-level home near the shore of Lake Erie, a short drive from downtown Cleveland. Diane's days were filled with meetings, phone calls, and the relentless demands of her career. But in the evenings, she often found solace walking along the quiet waterfront trails, her mind turning over thoughts no one else could hear. Her closest friend, Linda Marks, remembered Diane as fiercely independent yet quietly vulnerable. She had this way of holding the room, you know, like she was always listening for something just out of reach. Sometimes I think she felt trapped, like she wanted to escape, but didn't know where to go. That August, Diane seemed more withdrawn than usual. Linda recalled a few phone calls that felt off, the kind where you hear hesitation beneath the words, where laughter is a little too forced, where silences stretch longer than they should. On the evening of August 14th, Diane left work later than usual, her car disappearing into the dusky streets as she headed home. Her routine was simple: dinner, a phone call to her sister in Pennsylvania, then bed. But that night, Diane never made it home. The following morning, when Diane failed to answer her sister's call, a ripple of concern spread quietly through her family. By afternoon, Linda was at Diane's doorstep, the unease growing heavier with each unanswered knock. Inside, the house was undisturbed. No sign of struggle, no note, no indication of why Diane had vanished. The local police were called, and an initial search began. Diane's car was found parked in the driveway, the keys still inside. Personal belongings, purse, wallet, and shoes were all in place. It was as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. Over the next days, investigators canvassed the neighborhood, spoke to co-workers, retraced Diane's last known movements. Surveillance was scant in those pre-digital days, and leads quickly ran cold. Her phone record showed a few calls to unknown numbers in the days before she vanished, but none could be traced conclusively. Rumors started to swirl. Had Diane planned to leave? Was she running from someone? Or had something more sinister taken her? The community held its breath, hoping for answers that did not come. Months passed. Posters with Diane's smiling face appeared on telephone poles and storefront windows. Volunteers joined search parties scouring wooded areas and lake shores. Yet no trace of her was found. Her family clung to hope, even as the harsh reality of uncertainty gnawed at their hearts. As the years slipped by, Diane Taylor's disappearance became one of those haunting mysteries, a ghost story whispered at town gatherings, a cautionary tale that no one wanted to face but no one could forget. Despite the lack of resolution, the case continued to surface in cold case files and local legends, a reminder that sometimes the darkness that hides in plain sight refuses to be illuminated. This is the story of Diane Taylor, a woman who vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of questions and a community forever changed. The days that followed Diane Taylor's disappearance were marked by a quiet frenzy, a desperate scramble to piece together the fragments of a life suddenly paused in mid-motion. For those who loved her, the sudden absence was a rending shock, like a thread pulled loose in the fabric of their everyday world. Detective Harold Whitman, a seasoned investigator with the Bay Village Police Department, was assigned to the case. Whitman was known for his methodical approach and calm demeanor, a steady presence in the chaos that often accompanied disappearances. But even he found himself unsettled by the gaps in Diane's story, the things that didn't add up, the silence where answers should have been. On the afternoon of August 15th, Whitman and his team began their work in earnest. The house was examined thoroughly, every corner scrutinized for clues. Diane's belongings lay untouched, her clothes folded neatly in the closet, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen table, the scent of brewed coffee lingering in the air. No signs of forced entry, no indications of struggle. Her car, a dark blue sedan, remained parked in the driveway, its doors locked and windows rolled up. Inside, Whitman noted a set of keys on the passenger seat, a small leather-bound notebook resting on the dashboard. The notebook became an early focus. Inside, Diane had jotted down appointments, contact numbers and cryptic notes, some clearly work-related, others more personal, vague references to meetings, people and places that did not immediately clarify. One entry caught Whitman's attention, a phone number circled twice, accompanied by the initials JW, no immediate matches in her contacts. The detective cross-referenced this with phone records, discovering several calls between Diane and an unlisted number in the weeks preceding her disappearance. Tracing the number led to a payphone at a gas station several miles out of town, a detail that raised more questions than answers. Who was Diane calling, and why from a payphone when she had a personal cell phone? Meanwhile, Diane's friends and family were interviewed extensively. Linda Marks recounted their last conversations, moments tinged with unease. Diane had mentioned feeling watched, though she brushed it off as paranoia. She talked about stress at work, but never about fearing for her safety. Her sister Karen described Diane as a private person, reluctant to share burdens, preferring to shoulder them alone. "We all thought she was strong," Karen said quietly. "Maybe too strong." Local residents were asked if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual that weekend. One neighbor recalled seeing a man loitering near Diane's house late in the evening, a figure unfamiliar to the area, described as tall, with dark hair and a weathered face. But when officers checked local records, no one fitting the description was linked to any known incidents. The gas station attendant at the payphone location was questioned repeatedly. He remembered a woman matching Diane's description making calls there, but could not identify the person she was contacting. Days turned into weeks, and the search expanded beyond Bay Village. Volunteers combed wooded areas, shoreline beaches, and abandoned buildings nearby. Flyers were distributed throughout Ohio and neighboring states, urging anyone with information to come forward. Despite the efforts, Diane's trail grew cold. At the same time, the community grappled with the ripple effects of the case. Bay Village, with its close-knit feel and tree-lined streets, was not accustomed to such a haunting void. Parents worried about their children, neighbors looked over their shoulders, and whispers of danger drifted through cafes and grocery stores. Some speculated about a planned escape,
imagining Diane tired of the pressures of her life, seeking anonymity elsewhere. Others feared something far darker, a violent abduction, perhaps linked to unknown enemies or secret conflicts. Detective Whitman, meanwhile, delved deeper into Diane's background. He discovered that Diane had recently been involved in a contentious dispute with a colleague at work, a man named James Whitaker, a senior executive known for his aggressive style and volatile temper. Whitman obtained records indicating Diane had threatened to report James for harassment, a claim that had been dismissed internally, but left lingering tension. James Whitaker was brought in for questioning. He denied any involvement in Diane's disappearance, but admitted to arguments over business matters. His alibi for the night of August 14th was shaky. He claimed to have been working late at his office, but had no witnesses. Though suspicion grew, the evidence was circumstantial. Without concrete proof, authorities could not press charges. The investigation took a grim turn when a local fisherman discovered a bloodied scarf caught in reeds along the Lake Erie shoreline, about a mile from Diane's home. The scarf was tested and found to contain traces of Diane's DNA, confirming she had been at the lake near the time of her disappearance. However, no other evidence was found to explain what happened next. Had she been attacked and left for dead? Or had she managed to escape into the water, never to be seen again? As the fall months crept in, the case grew colder. Local news outlets revisited the story, reminding the public of the unresolved tragedy. Calls flooded police stations with tips, many of which were dead ends. Diane's family held on to fragile hope. They clung to memories and moments, to the belief that answers might come with time. Linda Marks spearheaded community efforts to keep Diane's name alive, organizing vigils and awareness campaigns. She spoke at schools about the importance of safety and vigilance, hoping to prevent others from suffering a similar fate. Still, the mystery loomed. One particularly eerie detail surfaced in late 1983. A man named Robert Allen, a drifter with a criminal record for assault, was seen in the vicinity of Bay Village shortly before Diane's disappearance. Allen was known to frequent gas stations and transient shelters, drifting from town to town. His presence had never been confirmed by police in Bay Village, but several witnesses claimed to have seen a man matching his description near the payphone Diane had used. Despite investigations, Allen disappeared before officers could question him, slipping into the anonymity of the road. This loose thread added a layer of complexity. Was Diane's disappearance connected to a stranger with a violent past? Or was it unrelated? Detective Whitman never lost faith that the case could be solved. He continued to revisit old evidence, consult with colleagues, and monitor developments in forensic science. In the late 1990s, with advances in DNA technology, investigators attempted to re-examine the scarf and other collected items. Unfortunately, degradation over time limited the usable samples. No new leads emerged. The case file grew thick, layered with reports, interviews and theories, but the truth remained elusive. For Diane's family, the absence was a constant ache, a silent companion through years of birthdays, holidays and quiet evenings. They learned to live with uncertainty, balancing memories of the woman they loved with the haunting question of what truly happened that August night. The town of Bay Village bore its own scars, an undercurrent of unease beneath the surface of everyday life. Parents whispered warnings to their children, neighbors watched unfamiliar faces more closely, and yet life continued, carrying Diane's story forward like a soft echo in the wind. The vanishing of Diane Taylor became a chapter in the town's history, a reminder of how quickly normalcy can fracture, how fragile safety truly is. And still the search for answers endured, carried by those who refused to forget. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the case of Diane Taylor's disappearance settled into the category of unresolved mysteries, filed away, revisited occasionally, yet never forgotten. For Detective Harold Whitman, the passage of time did not dull his resolve. He remained committed to piecing together what had transpired in those elusive hours, that August night, even as new cases demanded his attention. The town of Bay Village, meanwhile, continued to carry Diane's absence like a shadow, a silent weight beneath the everyday rhythms. The lake, once a place of quiet walks and afternoon fishing, now held an edge of danger, a place where memories and fears mingled. In the years following Diane's disappearance, several developments unfolded, some hopeful, others heartbreaking, that added layers of complexity to the mystery. One thread emerged from an unexpected source: a woman named Marianne Caldwell, who moved to Bay Village in the late 1980s. Marianne was a social worker, familiar with the patterns of trauma and abuse that often lurked beneath the surface of seemingly peaceful communities. During a routine case, she encountered a man who mentioned a woman named Diane, his tone heavy with regret and fear. Intrigued, Marianne began to ask questions, quietly weaving connections that others had missed. The man, a reclusive figure named David Harlan, was known locally as a drifter with a violent temper and a history of arrests for assault and harassment. Though he had no formal connection to Diane, his words hinted at a knowledge of her disappearance that was unsettling. He said he'd seen her that night. Marianne later recalled, but he wouldn't say more. He was scared. Marianne shared this information with Detective Whitman, who reopened lines of inquiry surrounding David Harlan. However, Harlan was evasive, and police could not tie him conclusively to Diane's vanishing. Despite this, the revelation injected fresh energy into the cold case. Around the same time, another piece of the puzzle came from a distant relative of Diane's, a cousin named Ellen, who had been estranged for years. Ellen reached out to the family with a letter, revealing that Diane had confided in her about a series of strange phone calls and threatening letters she had received in the months leading up to her disappearance. The letters were never found, and no official reports were made, but the suggestion of stalking cast a new light on Diane's final days. The family wondered why Diane had kept this secret, who might have sent such menacing messages, and whether these threats were connected to her work, her personal life, or something else entirely. Detective Whitman followed this lead, searching archives and contacting former colleagues. Though no suspects emerged, the idea of a calculated campaign of intimidation added a chilling dimension to the case. In the mid-1990s, technological advances offered renewed hope. The advent of DNA testing and forensic analysis promised tools that had been unavailable during the initial investigation. The Bay Village Police Department arranged for the preservation and testing of the bloodied scarf found near the lake. Samples were analyzed repeatedly, but contamination and time complicated efforts. Still, the possibility that DNA evidence might one day reveal the truth kept the case alive. As the new millennium approached, Diane's disappearance took on a spectral quality in public consciousness. It became a story told quietly in coffee shops, a subject of local lore and whispered speculation. Some clung to the belief that she had been taken against her will and met a tragic fate. Others hoped she had managed to start anew somewhere far away, cutting ties and vanishing by choice. This uncertainty gnawed at those left behind. Linda Marks, Diane's closest friend, dedicated herself to advocacy for missing persons, channeling grief into action. She worked with organizations to improve search efforts and raise awareness, hoping to prevent others from fading away as Diane had. In 2005, a startling development briefly rekindled the case. A man named Thomas Reed, living in a nearby county, was arrested for unrelated charges. During questioning, Reed made cryptic references to knowing what happened to Diane, but then abruptly refused to elaborate. Police investigated, but found no evidence linking Reed directly to the disappearance. Still, his comments hinted at shadows hidden just out of reach. Detective Whitman, nearing retirement, reflected on the case with a mixture of frustration and determination. He knew that many mysteries remained unsolved, but he also understood the importance of keeping hope alive for families desperate for closure. In interviews and public talks, he emphasized the need for communities to support each other, to listen closely, and to never forget those who disappear without explanation. Through the years, Diane's family endured the hardest part: the silence. No bodies found, no confessions, no breakthroughs, only the quiet absence and the memories that refused to fade. Karen, Diane's sister, described the long struggle. It's a different kind of grief, one that doesn't end. You live with questions you can't answer. The impact rippled through generations, shaping how the family viewed safety, trust and the fragility of life. Bay Village itself evolved, but the echoes of Diane's vanishing remained embedded in its collective memory. Each anniversary brought renewed reflection, moments of quiet remembrance, and a shared sense of loss. Local historians and journalists revisited the case from time to time, uncovering small details that had been overlooked. One article published in 2010 suggested possible links to a series of unsolved assaults in the region during that era, speculating that Diane's disappearance might be connected to a serial offender. Though speculative, such theories underscored how many pieces of the puzzle remained scattered. As social media grew in influence, online forums dedicated to missing persons cases began to discuss Diane's story. Strangers from around the world shared theories, compared notes, and occasionally unearthed new leads. This digital attention brought a bittersweet sense of connection, proof that Diane was not forgotten, even far beyond the shores of Lake Erie. Yet despite these efforts, the core mystery persisted. No definitive answers emerged. No resolution to the silent question, what happened to Diane Taylor on that August night in 1983? For Detective Whitman, the unanswered questions were a source of both pain and purpose. He often pondered the fragile threads of fate, the moments when decisions intersect with danger, when ordinary lives are forever altered in ways impossible to predict. In quiet moments at his desk, he reviewed the case files one last time, tracing the lines of inquiry, the suspects, the possibilities. He thought of Diane, not just as a missing person, but as a woman full of dreams, fears and untold stories. And he hoped that someday, somehow, the truth would surface. Until then, the search remained a vigil, a watch kept by those who refused to let Diane Taylor's story fade into darkness. The years stretched on. Time, which had once seemed so relentless in its passage, began to feel like an ocean, vast and deep, swallowing moments whole, and scattering memories like driftwood along the shoreline. Yet the case of Diane Taylor remained alive in the hearts of those who refused to surrender to silence. Detective Harold Whitman had long since retired, but his dedication did not wane. In the quiet hours of his days, he returned often to the file, rereading reports, re-examining photographs, and replaying witness statements like a haunting melody that refused to leave him. Though the initial investigation had concluded without resolution, new avenues of inquiry began to emerge with the shifting tides of forensic science and technology in the 21st century. One of the most promising came in 2015, when advances in genealogical DNA testing revolutionized the field of cold case investigations. With consent from Diane's family, investigators sought to re-examine the preserved DNA evidence from the bloodied scarf found near Lake Erie decades earlier. The goal was to uncover any familial connections or matches that could illuminate Diane's fate. The sample, though degraded, yielded partial profiles. Cross-referenced with national and international databases, the DNA revealed an unexpected connection, traces of an unidentified male, whose genetic markers suggested origins in the Midwest but no exact match in criminal or genealogical records. This partial lead prompted renewed interest from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, who reached out to Whitman for his insights and historical knowledge of the case. Though retired, Whitman's expertise and familiarity with the community proved invaluable. Together, the retired detective and active investigators began to piece together fragments that had once seemed isolated and insignificant. One detail stood out, a recurring mention in Diane's notebook of a location called the Hollow, a wooded area several miles from her home. Previously overlooked due to its nondescript nature, the Hollow was a patch of dense forest near an old quarry, a place locals sometimes avoided after dark. Using satellite imagery and ground searches, teams combed the area in hopes of finding overlooked evidence. In the summer of 2016, searchers uncovered a small weathered metal box buried beneath layers of leaf litter near the base of an ancient oak tree. Inside were personal items, a pair of Diane's earrings, a crumpled photograph of her and Linda Marks, and a faded journal filled with scribbled entries in Diane. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community, and reignited media attention. The journal revealed new facets of Diane's life, her struggles with stress, her growing fear of an unknown presence she described only as the Watcher, and cryptic references to meetings with a man she identified by the initials. The entries painted a portrait of increasing anxiety and isolation. She wrote of feeling followed, of hearing footsteps behind her on quiet streets, and of a shadowed figure lurking near her workplace. Investigators cross-referenced these initials with the earlier lead, James Whittaker, the colleague with whom Diane had had a contentious relationship. Whittaker, now in his late 60s, was brought in for questioning once again. Under scrutiny, he maintained his innocence, but acknowledged his temper had caused friction. He denied any involvement in Diane's disappearance, insisting he had no reason to harm her. Further investigation uncovered that Whittaker had a documented history of aggressive behavior toward female employees, but had never been charged. His alibi for the night of August 14th remained unsubstantiated, but no physical evidence linked him to a crime. As the case unfolded, new witnesses came forward. A woman named Emily Harper, who had worked at the same firm as Diane, recounted a conversation overheard between Diane and an unidentified man who warned her to stop pursuing a certain project. Emily's account hinted at the possibility that Diane's disappearance may have been connected to her professional activities, work she had kept secret from friends and family. The nature of this project was unclear, but documents recovered from Diane's office suggested involvement in investigating financial irregularities within the company. Could Diane have uncovered something worth silencing? This theory introduced a complex dimension. Was her disappearance the result of a deliberate attempt to suppress information, or had she stumbled unknowingly into danger? Amid these revelations, a somber discovery brought a final layer of tragedy. In late 2017, during excavation near the quarry, skeletal remains were found partially buried beneath layers of earth. The remains were badly decomposed, but forensic analysis confirmed they were those of a young woman, estimated to be in her early 20s, the same age as Diane at the time of her disappearance. Clothing remnants and personal effects suggested the remains were indeed hers. The news devastated Diane's family and the community. At last, the silence was broken, but the answers they sought were incomplete. Cause of death could not be conclusively determined, but evidence pointed to foul play. The question of who was responsible remained. In the months that followed, the investigation intensified. Authorities renewed efforts to trace the unidentified male DNA, expanded interviews, and re-examined all persons of interest. Public appeals encouraged anyone with information to come forward, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Linda Marks spoke publicly, her voice steady despite the years of grief. "We finally have Diane back," she said. "Now we need to find justice." Yet despite the momentum, the case was far from closed. Some threads unraveled into dead ends, others tangled into deeper complexities. The Watcher Diane had feared was never identified. The man linked to the DNA remained a mystery, his identity obscured by time and circumstance. James Whittaker maintained his denial, yet suspicion lingered like a cloud over his name. Diane's family wrestled with bittersweet closure, grateful to know what had become of her but haunted by the lack of answers surrounding her final moments. Detective Whitman, now in his late 70s, reflected on the journey. The case had spanned decades, a testament to the resilience of those who seek truth amidst darkness. He acknowledged that sometimes, justice comes slowly, and not all wounds are fully healed, but he remained hopeful. Hopeful that one day, through persistence and the relentless pursuit of truth, Diane Taylor's story would be told in full, that her name would no longer be whispered in questions, but spoken with peace, that those responsible would be held accountable. Until then, the fragments of Diane's life, her laughter, her fears, her courage would live on in the memories of those who loved her, and in the quiet watchfulness of a town that refused to forget.
The haunting mystery of the Sodder children disappearance. In the early morning hours of Christmas Eve, 1945, the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, was engulfed in flames. George and Jenny Sodder, along with their 9 children, had settled down to sleep after a Christmas Eve celebration. The fire destroyed much of the house, reducing it to ash and rubble by morning. 5 of the Sodder children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny and Betty, were never found. Authorities ruled that the children had perished in the fire, but George and Jenny Sodder refused to believe their children had died so easily. Their relentless search for answers became one of America's most baffling disappearances. George Sodder was a Sicilian immigrant who had built a successful business selling trucks and automobiles. He was a hard-working man who valued family above all else. Jenny, his wife, was a devout woman, deeply rooted in tradition and family. Together they raised 9 children in their modest home on a quiet street. The family was close-knit, known in the community for their warmth and generosity. On that Christmas Eve, after a joyful evening with extended family and friends, the Sodders retired for the night. At some point in the early hours, smoke was noticed by a neighbor. George and his family were awakened by the smell of burning. He tried desperately to rescue his children, but was hampered by what seemed like the inexplicable. The house's phone line had been cut, and his truck, parked outside, wouldn't start. As the fire raged, George and Jenny managed to save 4 of their children, but the other 5 vanished without a trace. The official fire department investigation concluded the fire was accidental, caused by faulty electrical wiring in the attic. The charred remains, however, told a confusing story. No remains of the 5 missing children were ever recovered from the site, a fact that puzzled both the family and the authorities. It was as if the children had simply disappeared into thin air. What set this case apart was the Sodders' unwavering belief that their children had been abducted. They received a strange phone call on Christmas morning. A hoarse voice repeatedly whispered, "We're alive," before hanging up. Despite countless tips, sightings and theories over the years, the truth remained elusive. One of the more chilling elements was the series of strange occurrences leading up to the fire. George Sodder had reportedly received threats from local individuals unhappy with his refusal to support certain political causes during the wartime period. Letters arrived warning him to leave town, and there was an unnerving sense that someone was watching the family. George himself believed the fire was no accident but an act of arson, designed to cover up the kidnapping of his children. The cut phone lines and disabled truck only strengthened this suspicion. Over the years, the family tirelessly pursued any lead that might explain the disappearance. They plastered missing person posters across the country, placed an ad in newspapers, and even built a billboard along a nearby highway depicting the missing children's faces. Despite this, official investigations eventually stalled, and the case grew cold. Decades later, new clues would emerge, yet the case remains officially unsolved, a haunting enigma in the annals of American crime. In the wake of the devastating fire that consumed the Sodder family home on Christmas Eve, 1945, the town of Fayetteville was awash in shock and confusion. The flames had reduced the house to a smoldering ruin, leaving behind little more than twisted metal, charred timber, and unanswered questions. George and Jenny Sodder, the parents, were left with a heartache that no one could begin to understand. 4 of their children had been rescued, but 5, their oldest and youngest children, were gone, vanished as if swallowed by the night itself. The fire department investigators arrived early the next morning to comb through the ruins. Their conclusion was swift: a tragic accident. They blamed an electrical malfunction in the attic, possibly caused by old wiring, as the spark that ignited the blaze. The Sodders, however, were unconvinced. The circumstances around the fire defied simple explanation. George's truck, parked just outside the house, had been disabled, the wires cut, and the distributor tampered with, rendering the vehicle unusable. The family's phone line, their only link to the outside world during those critical moments, had been severed. George tried desperately to call for help, but found only silence. This detail was crucial. It suggested a calculated effort to isolate the family during the fire, to ensure no aid could arrive in time. But why? In the days after the fire, the community rallied around the Sodders. The townspeople, neighbors, and even strangers donated money, food, and support. Local officials and the media quickly became involved, eager to piece together what had happened on that terrible night. Yet, no trace of the 5 missing children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, was ever found amid the ashes. No bones, no belongings, no evidence to suggest that they had perished in the fire. This absence would prove to be one of the most haunting aspects of the case. George and Jenny refused to accept the idea that their children had died in the flames. They had been raised to be resilient, to believe in family above all else. Their hearts clung to the hope that the children were alive somewhere, that fate had not been so cruel. To find answers, George and Jenny began a tireless search. They plastered the region with missing children posters. They took out newspaper advertisements. Most famously, in 1952, George erected a large billboard along a busy highway near Fayetteville. It displayed photographs of the missing children with the question, "Have you seen these children?" This public plea became a symbol of their enduring hope and sorrow. As the investigation unfolded, George's suspicions about the fire being deliberate grew stronger. In the weeks before the fire, George had been the target of threats and harassment. His business had suffered from local sabotage, and he was warned to stay out of certain political matters. During World War II, tensions were high, especially in communities with immigrant families. George Sodder, a Sicilian immigrant, was outspoken in his beliefs and refused to support certain causes aligned with the Italian fascists, a position that drew resentment from some locals. Threatening letters arrived at the Sodder home, warning George to leave town. A shadow seemed to follow the family. One particularly chilling episode came just days before the fire. George was approached by a stranger on the street, who said, "You'll lose more than just your business if you don't stay quiet." The meaning behind the words was clear, yet chilling. The night of the fire was fraught with strange happenings. George remembered waking briefly during the night and noticing a light outside the house, like a lantern flickering near the trees. He assumed it was a neighbor checking in, but later came to suspect something more sinister. When he awoke to the smell of smoke, he rushed outside to find the house engulfed. Despite frantic efforts to save his children, the sabotaged truck and cut phone lines hindered his attempts to get help. In the days following, the family received a strange and cryptic phone call early on Christmas morning. A hoarse voice whispered repeatedly, "We're alive," before abruptly hanging up. The call left the Sodders stunned and desperate. Was it a cruel hoax? Or a real clue that the children had been taken, alive, somewhere beyond reach? George pursued this lead relentlessly. He traveled across the country, following up on countless reports and supposed sightings of the missing children. Many turned out to be false leads, but the family's conviction never wavered. One of the most perplexing pieces of evidence came from an anonymous letter received by the family a few years later. The letter described the 5 children living in an orphanage on the West Coast. Despite attempts to verify the claim, no such orphanage was found, and the letter's origin remained a mystery. As years turned to decades, the case became a cold file in the eyes of law enforcement. But for George and Jenny Sodder, the search never ended. They spent their lives chasing shadows, hoping for a miracle. Their story touched many, becoming a haunting symbol of loss, mystery, and undying hope. In the broader context, the Sodder children disappearance highlights the complexities of post-war America. Tensions ran high, and immigrant families sometimes faced prejudice and suspicion. The case also underscores how investigations can be hampered by limited resources, misinformation, and the limits of forensic science of the era. There is no shortage of theories surrounding what happened that night. Some believe the children died in the fire, but their remains were somehow destroyed or removed. Others think the children were kidnapped, possibly as retribution or due to family enemies. Some speculate the children were sold or trafficked, though no credible evidence supports this. In the decades since, the Sodder family story has inspired books, documentaries, and countless articles. Yet the truth remains elusive, a mystery shrouded by time. George Sodder passed away in 1969, still haunted by the fate of his missing children. Jenny lived into her 90s, never relinquishing the hope that her children might be found. Their devotion remains a testament to the strength of parental love in the face of the unimaginable. Following the tragic fire and the immediate aftermath, George and Jenny Sodder refused to accept the official conclusion that their children had perished in the flames. Instead, they embarked on a relentless quest to find any trace of Morris,
Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, the 5 children who had vanished without a trace. Their search was fueled by a mixture of hope and grief, and it took them far beyond the borders of Fayetteville, West Virginia. They were aided by the support of the local community, but increasingly found themselves isolated, chasing leads that often led to dead ends. One of the most puzzling pieces of this mystery emerged with an anonymous letter sent to the family a few years after the fire. The letter suggested that the missing Sodder children were alive and being held in an orphanage far from home. Specifically, the letter described a group of children who matched their descriptions living in an orphanage in the western United States. George and Jenny took the letter seriously. They traveled across multiple states to investigate orphanages and institutions that might match the description, yet despite exhaustive efforts, no orphanage was found that matched the letter's claims. The letter's origin remained unknown, adding to the mystery rather than clarifying it. Over the years, the family pursued hundreds of reported sightings of the missing children. Some were vague, others detailed, but none were conclusively verified. One of the most intriguing accounts came in the early 1950s from a couple living in Florida. They reported seeing a young woman named Jenny Sodder working as a waitress in a diner. When the Sodders followed up, the woman denied any connection and vanished before they could learn more. Another tip came from a man in Pennsylvania, who said he had befriended a young man named Morris Sodder, living under a different name. The young man claimed to have no memory of his past but showed a birthmark matching descriptions provided by the Sodders. Unfortunately, the man disappeared before George and Jenny could investigate further. These tantalizing glimpses only deepened the family's resolve. They never gave up hope, no matter how slim the chance. George Sodder went so far as to purchase a billboard on Route 16 near Fayetteville in 1952, a few years after the fire. The billboard prominently displayed photographs of the missing children and a plea for information. The billboard became a symbol of the family's unyielding hope and a lasting reminder of the mystery. Despite the personal crusade, law enforcement's interest in the case waned. The Fayetteville police and state authorities closed their files, concluding there was insufficient evidence of foul play. The fire was deemed accidental, and the missing children were presumed dead. This official stance frustrated the Sodders, who continued to insist that the fire had been set deliberately and that their children had been kidnapped. The theory of kidnapping is supported by several key factors. The severed phone line and disabled truck were seen as deliberate acts to prevent the family from calling for help or escaping. The lack of any remains or evidence of the children's deaths at the fire site was highly unusual. The suggestion that the children had been taken away for reasons unknown, whether as revenge, political intimidation, or something more sinister, remains a chilling possibility. Another strange development occurred shortly after the fire. George Sodder discovered a man named Newt Lee working as a truck driver near the Sodder home. Lee reportedly told George that he had seen the children alive and well in the days following the fire. According to Lee, he had given rides to some of the Sodder children in the neighboring town of Fayetteville. George was intrigued but skeptical, as no one else could confirm the claim. Lee's story added another layer of mystery to an already confusing puzzle. The Sodders also received cryptic phone calls and mysterious messages over the years. On Christmas morning in 1946, exactly 1 year after the fire, the family received an eerie call. A hoarse voice repeated the words, "We are alive," several times before hanging up. The call raised hopes, but also suggested that someone was deliberately taunting the family, keeping the mystery alive but out of reach. George believed that local political tensions and ethnic animosities may have been the motive behind the kidnapping. During World War II, the Sodder family of Sicilian descent faced hostility due to Italy's alliance with the Axis powers. George had openly opposed fascist sympathizers in the community, and some neighbors had threatened the family in the months before the fire. It is possible that the kidnapping was a form of intimidation or retaliation, though no proof of this theory ever surfaced. The Sodder family's search for their children extended beyond physical investigations. They engaged psychics and mediums, desperate for any hint of their children's fate. Jenny Sodder, in particular, placed great faith in spiritual messages, and believed that her children were alive somewhere, waiting to be found. Despite the heartbreak and frustration, the family never stopped advocating for answers. They kept their story in the public eye through newspaper ads, radio interviews, and the now iconic billboard. Their resilience drew national attention, turning their private tragedy into a public mystery. In the decades following the fire, the Sodder children disappearance became one of America's most enigmatic unsolved cases. The family's tragedy speaks to the fear of the unknown, the inability to find closure or understand a sudden loss. Many who have studied the case believe the truth lies buried somewhere in the past, obscured by time and silence. Whether the children died in the fire or were taken away remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Sodder's story is one of profound love and unwavering hope, a testament to the enduring human spirit. As the years slipped by, the landscape around Fayetteville changed. The old Sodder home was replaced by a quiet neighborhood, and the world moved forward. But for George and Jenny Sodder, time only deepened the ache of uncertainty. Their search for the missing five became not just a mission, but the defining purpose of their lives. Despite growing older and facing the realities of aging, neither gave up on the belief that their children might still be out there somewhere beyond the horizon of their grief. The passage of time brought new twists and renewed interest in the case, but it also exposed the limitations of memory and evidence. One of the most compelling developments occurred in 1968, when George Sodder received a startling letter from a man claiming to be his son Louis. The letter was postmarked in Alabama and included a note describing personal details that only a family member could know. It claimed that Louis was alive, but living under a different name and circumstances that prevented him from returning home. George and Jenny were cautious but hopeful. They arranged to meet the man in person. The meeting, however, proved inconclusive. The man who claimed to be Louis Sodder was evasive, and while he knew certain family details, there were inconsistencies that raised doubt. No definitive proof emerged to confirm his identity. Some speculate the letter was a hoax, perhaps a cruel trick played on grieving parents. Others believe it was a cry for help from one of the missing children, trapped in a life they could not escape. In the years that followed, various individuals came forward, claiming to have new information. One story told of a young woman in California, who recognized herself in the Sodder children's photographs, but was reluctant to reveal her identity. Another spoke of a man who claimed to have witnessed the children being taken to a remote location shortly after the fire. Each tip was carefully investigated, but none led to a breakthrough. The case attracted the attention of journalists and authors. Books were written, documentaries produced, and the mystery rekindled public fascination. Yet the puzzle pieces never quite fit. Modern technology, including advances in DNA analysis, has sparked hope that one day the mystery might be solved. In recent years, descendants of the Sodder family have used DNA databases to search for matches that might lead to answers. Though no confirmed matches have emerged, the effort continues. The story of the Sodder children is often described as a cautionary tale about the fragility of truth and the persistence of hope. It embodies a paradox, how sometimes the absence of evidence can become more haunting than its presence. The official cause of the fire remains listed as accidental electrical failure, but lingering questions persist. Was the fire truly accidental, or was it the cover for a more sinister act? Why were the phone lines cut and the truck sabotaged if no foul play was involved? These questions remain unanswered. The Sodder family's experience highlights the profound impact that unresolved tragedy can have on a community. Neighbors who once supported the family grew distant, some believing the children had died, others suspecting darker secrets. The community itself became divided, caught between empathy and suspicion. In the end, the story of the Sodder children is one of deep human emotions: love, loss, fear, and hope. George and Jenny Sodder endured unimaginable pain yet clung to the belief that their children might live. Their story is a testament to parental devotion and the haunting power of mystery. As you prepare to drift into sleep, imagine the quiet December night in Fayetteville, with snow falling softly over the hills, the faded billboard still standing by the roadside, and a family's hope that never dies.
In the late spring of 1993, the small town of West Memphis, Arkansas, seemed like any other quiet southern community. Tree-lined streets stretched beneath a steady sun, and families settled into their routines with a comforting predictability. Children played in backyards, the hum of cicadas filled the air, and neighbors exchanged familiar greetings. Yet beneath the surface of this peaceful town, a darkness was about to break, one that would haunt its residents for decades to come. On the morning of May 5th, a group of boys had gathered near Robin Hood Hills, a wooded area just beyond the edges of town. 3 young friends, 8-year-olds Steve Branch and Christopher Byers, along with 7-year-old Michael Moore, set out on what should have been a typical day of adventure. But as hours slipped by, their absence stirred worry among their families. When dusk approached and the boys still had not returned, a search was launched. The community's concern grew with each passing hour. Volunteers fanned out through the woods, calling out names, their voices growing hoarse in the cool evening air. The police joined the search, combing the dense underbrush, shining flashlights into the shadows. But as the night deepened, hope began to wane. Then, just before midnight, a grim discovery was made. The bodies of the 3 boys were found submerged in a shallow creek bed, their clothes torn, their small forms bearing signs of violence. The shock rippled through West Memphis like a sudden storm, leaving the town stunned and grieving. The investigation that followed was swift and intense. From the start, the police focused on a narrative that would soon grip the nation. Rumors and whispers began to spread, talk of satanic rituals, of dark forces at work in Robin Hood Hills. The satanic panic of the era cast a long shadow over the proceedings, coloring public perception with fear and suspicion. Among those under scrutiny were 3 local teenagers, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly Jr. Damian, with his long black hair, dark clothing and fascination with the occult, was an easy target for suspicion. Jason, quiet and reserved, was known as Damian's friend. Jesse, who struggled academically and socially, became the center of the investigation after a confession emerged under questionable circumstances. The trial that followed was contentious and deeply polarizing. The prosecution painted a chilling picture, a satanic cult led by Damian that had lured the boys into the woods and killed them in a ritualistic manner. The evidence, however, was thin. No physical proof conclusively linked the teenagers to the crime scene. Instead, much of the case rested on Jesse's confession, a confession that was inconsistent, riddled with inaccuracies, and obtained after hours of interrogation. Yet, in the charged atmosphere of the trial, where fear seemed to overshadow reason, the jury was convinced. Damian Eccles was sentenced to death, while Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly Jr. were given life sentences. Behind the courtroom walls, the lives of these 3 young men were irrevocably altered. Damian's days were consumed by the grim reality of death row, a fate he faced with a quiet dignity that won him supporters far beyond Arkansas. Jason and Jesse grappled with the weight of incarceration, their futures erased in an instant. As the West Memphis 3 began serving their sentences, the case began to attract attention from outside the town. Documentaries, books, and investigative reports questioned the validity of the convictions. Legal experts and activists pointed to glaring errors in the investigation, the coerced confession, the lack of forensic evidence, and the bias of the prosecution. Meanwhile, the families of the boys who had died mourned deeply, their grief complicated by the ongoing uncertainty surrounding the case. Though 3 young men were convicted, many questioned whether justice had truly been served. Years passed, and the West Memphis 3 remained imprisoned, their names a rallying cry for those who believed in their innocence. Advances in forensic science offered new hope. DNA testing on evidence from the crime scene revealed no match to any of the 3 teenagers, but instead pointed to an unknown male. The movement to free the West Memphis 3 grew stronger. Petitions circulated, protests were held, and a global community of supporters emerged. Their story became one of the most infamous cases of wrongful conviction in modern American history. Still, despite growing evidence and public pressure, the legal system moved slowly. Appeals were filed and denied, and the 3 men faced years more behind bars. The weight of time pressed heavily on all involved. Damian, Jason and Jesse endured unimaginable hardship, their innocence unproven but fiercely claimed. The town of West Memphis remained divided, caught between mourning lost children and grappling with the uncertainty of a justice system gone awry. As dawn broke on the decades to come, the story of the West Memphis Three would continue to unfold, one marked by sorrow, resilience, and the unyielding quest for truth. The years following the conviction of Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly Jr. were marked by a slow but growing ripple of doubt that began to spread far beyond the borders of West Memphis. What initially seemed like a straightforward, though tragic case took on new layers of complexity as the world outside scrutinized the evidence and the methods that had put three young men behind bars for a crime so horrific. At the heart of this doubt was the confession of Jesse Miskelly Jr., a young man who at the time of his arrest was just 16 years old. Jesse had been questioned by law enforcement for hours, reportedly without a lawyer or guardian present, and under intense pressure. His confession, read aloud in court, contained numerous inconsistencies, details that didn't match the crime scene, descriptions that clashed with witness statements, and even admissions that contradicted the physical evidence. Psychologists and legal experts later criticized the interrogation techniques, suggesting that Jesse's intellectual challenges and exhaustion may have made him vulnerable to suggestion. Despite these glaring issues, the confession became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. It was difficult for the jury to ignore what seemed like a direct admission of guilt, even as defense attorneys argued that the statement was coerced and unreliable. But beyond the courtroom, the confession was the spark that ignited a broader examination of the case. Damian Eccles, who was sentenced to death, was seen by many as the most vilified of the three. His appearance and interests set him apart in a small town where conformity was often expected. Damian's interest in Wicca and the occult, as well as his choice of clothing and long hair, made him an easy scapegoat in a community gripped by fear of satanic cults, a fear that had been fanned by media coverage and public hysteria during the early 1990s. Jason Baldwin, quieter and more reserved, was caught in the tide of suspicion largely because of his association with Damian. Jesse Miskelly Jr., struggling with developmental challenges, was viewed through a lens of mistrust and misunderstanding. The three were connected in the public mind as a dangerous trio, but for many outside observers, the conviction seemed less a result of solid evidence and more a product of fear and prejudice. In the years that followed, the case attracted the attention of filmmakers, journalists and advocates dedicated to uncovering the truth. Documentaries like Paradise Lost brought national and international attention to the story. The filmmakers delved into the trial records, interviewed those involved, and highlighted the flaws and inconsistencies that plagued the prosecution's case. Viewers were introduced to the faces of Damian, Jason and Jesse, not as criminals, but as young men caught in a nightmare of injustice. The impact of these documentaries was profound. They inspired a wave of support that crossed geographical and cultural boundaries. Supporters raised funds for legal appeals, organized awareness campaigns, and demanded that new forensic testing be conducted on the evidence from the crime scene. The forensic tests became a turning point. Using advances in DNA technology unavailable at the time of the original investigation, evidence from the crime scene was re-examined. The results were surprising. None of the DNA collected matched Damian, Jason or Jesse. Instead, the DNA pointed to unknown male contributors who had no connection to the three teenagers. This revelation cast a long shadow over the convictions. If the DNA at the scene did not belong to the men convicted, who had committed the crime, the question haunted not only the families of the victims and the convicted, but also the larger community and legal system tasked with finding justice. Despite the DNA evidence, the path to exoneration was fraught with challenges. The Arkansas legal system was slow to respond, constrained by procedural hurdles and a reluctance to overturn verdicts that had been handed down in a case that had drawn so much attention and emotion. For Damian, Jason and Jesse, the years in prison were marked by a mixture of despair and hope. Damian, in particular, became a symbol of resilience. On death row, he wrote poetry and letters, expressing his anguish but also his determination to maintain his innocence. His articulate reflections resonated with people worldwide,
further galvanizing the movement to free the West Memphis Three. Jason and Jesse, too, found ways to endure. Jason studied law from his prison cell, learning about the justice system that had condemned him. Jesse worked to improve his education and connected with advocates who believed in his innocence. The trio's bond remained unbroken, despite the isolation and uncertainty of prison life. Back in West Memphis, the families of the three murdered boys struggled with the ongoing turmoil. Steve Branch, Christopher Byers and Michael Moore were children whose lives had been stolen in a violent and senseless way. Their parents' grief was profound, yet many wrestled with the growing evidence that the men convicted might not be the true perpetrators. Some found solace in the hope that justice would eventually be served. Others remained haunted by the mystery of who had taken their sons. The community itself became divided. Some residents clung to their belief in the guilt of the West Memphis Three, unwilling to accept that the case could have been mishandled. Others, shaken by new evidence and media scrutiny, questioned the official narrative and hoped for a resolution that would bring clarity and peace. Amid this turbulence, a dedicated team of lawyers worked tirelessly to bring the truth to light. They filed motions for retrials, presented new forensic evidence, and pushed for the re-examination of the case. The legal battle was arduous, with setbacks and moments of hope interwoven. The case also sparked wider conversations about the criminal justice system. It highlighted the dangers of coerced confessions, the impact of media-fueled hysteria on trials, and the importance of scientific evidence in establishing guilt or innocence. It underscored how societal prejudices, whether based on appearance, interests or social status, could influence legal outcomes in profound ways. For the West Memphis Three, these years became a test of endurance. They clung to their innocence, holding on to the hope that one day the system would acknowledge its mistakes. Their story became a powerful example of how wrongful convictions could shatter lives and communities, but also how resilience, advocacy, and advances in forensic science could bring the possibility of redemption. As the new millennium dawned, the case took an unexpected turn. In 2011, after nearly 2 decades of imprisonment, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. were released from prison under an Alford plea, a legal arrangement in which the defendants maintain their innocence, but acknowledge that prosecutors have enough evidence to convict. The plea was controversial. Some saw it as a victory, a chance for the men to regain their freedom after years of wrongful incarceration. Others viewed it as a compromise that left too many questions unanswered. The official verdicts remained, but the public perception had shifted dramatically. The West Memphis Three walked free, stepping back into a world that had changed in their absence. The shadows of their past lingered, but their story had become a symbol of hope for those fighting against wrongful convictions everywhere. Yet the mystery of the murders remained unsolved. Who had taken Steve, Christopher, and Michael? The DNA evidence suggested others, but no new arrests were made. The case, once a fiery trial of accusation and fear, settled into the cold silence of an unresolved tragedy. As the years went by, the legacy of the West Memphis Three continued to inspire reflection and debate. Their ordeal was a cautionary tale about justice and injustice, about fear and truth, and about the human cost of a system that can sometimes fail the very people it is meant to protect. And so the story remained, a haunting reminder of 3 young boys lost to violence, and 3 young men whose lives were forever changed by a mystery that to this day defies final answers. The freedom that Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. regained in 2011 was both a relief and a burden. After nearly 18 years behind bars, the outside world they returned to was unfamiliar and unforgiving in its own ways. While they walked free, the scars of their incarceration remained deeply etched into their lives, and the shadows of the unsolved murders of Steve Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore lingered like an unshakable mist. Their release under the Alford plea, a legal mechanism allowing them to assert their innocence, while acknowledging that prosecutors had enough evidence to convict, was an unusual resolution. It was a compromise, born out of a complicated intersection of legal strategy, public pressure, and forensic revelations, but it also left a cloud of ambiguity hanging over the case. The men were free, but not declared innocent in the eyes of the law. and the question at the heart of the matter, who killed those 3 boys, remained unanswered. In the months and years that followed, Damien, Jason and Jesse faced the difficult task of rebuilding their lives. The transition was anything but smooth. Prison, with all its routine and constraints, had defined their existence for nearly 2 decades. Outside, they had to navigate a world that had changed dramatically. The rise of smartphones, social media, and a society much different from the one they had left as teenagers. Damien, in particular, struggled with the adjustment. His time on death row had been marked by intense isolation and moments of despair. Writing poetry and letters had been his refuge, and upon release, he sought to share his story with the world. Damien's words resonated with many, offering a raw and thoughtful perspective on injustice, resilience, and hope. He became a speaker and advocate, traveling to raise awareness about wrongful convictions and the flaws in the criminal justice system. Jason, who had spent years studying the law from his prison cell, used his newfound freedom to continue his legal education, determined to help others who, like him, had been caught in the system's errors. Jesse, with his gentle demeanor and determination, focused on healing and reconnecting with his family and community. Yet, even as they moved forward, the case remained a source of pain and frustration. The DNA evidence that had exonerated them implicated unknown individuals, but no new suspects were ever publicly identified or arrested. The official narrative still bore the mark of uncertainty, and the families of the victims were left without the closure they so desperately sought. The families of Steve, Christopher, and Michael bore the weight of grief alongside the torment of unanswered questions. Losing a child is an unimaginable sorrow, made infinitely more complex when the truth remains elusive. Some of the families continued to believe in the guilt of the West Memphis Three, unable to reconcile the new evidence with their loss. Others, while mourning, hoped that the real perpetrators would eventually be brought to justice. This divide in the community reflected a larger tension, the clash between a need for closure and the pursuit of truth. The desire to find someone accountable for such a brutal crime often collided with the realities of a flawed investigation and the complexities of the evidence. Over time, new efforts emerged to revisit the case. Advances in forensic science promised possibilities that had once seemed out of reach. Investigators revisited the physical evidence, searching for clues that might point to the true killers. Independent experts re-examined case files, hoping to uncover leads overlooked or dismissed during the original investigation. Yet, the passage of time proved a formidable adversary. Memories faded, witnesses moved away or passed on, and physical evidence degraded. The trail grew cold, and the case slipped further into the realm of mystery. The cultural impact of the West Memphis Three saga, however, remained strong. Their story inspired books, films, and ongoing discussions about justice and innocence. It served as a stark example of how fear, prejudice, and rushed judgments could warp the scales of justice. The case underscored the importance of critical scrutiny, the need for reliable forensic evidence, and the dangers of relying on coerced confessions and stereotypes. In the years following their release, Damien, Jason, and Jesse each grappled with the legacy of their ordeal. Damien's writings continued to explore themes of forgiveness, identity, and survival. He spoke openly about the toll the years of imprisonment had taken on his mental and physical health. Jason worked tirelessly on legal reform and wrongful conviction advocacy. Jesse focused on rebuilding his personal life and nurturing the relationships that had been strained by his time in prison. Their resilience was remarkable, yet they never fully escaped the shadow of their past. Public curiosity, media attention, and the lingering stigma of their convictions made normal life challenging. Friends and family were crucial supports, but the trauma of wrongful imprisonment left deep emotional wounds. Meanwhile, the question of who was responsible for the murders of Steve Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore remained unanswered. The DNA evidence found at the crime scene had introduced a new mystery, a mystery that some hoped would one day be solved. The names of other possible suspects surfaced over time, including those who had been briefly considered but dismissed during the original investigation. Some were local men with troubled pasts, but none were ever charged or brought to trial. Rumors and theories abounded, but concrete evidence remained elusive. Law enforcement agencies occasionally revisited the case, but without new leads, progress stalled. The families continued to advocate for renewed investigations, seeking answers and justice for their lost children. For many, the West Memphis 3 case symbolized the limits of the justice system when confronted with fear and misinformation. It highlighted how important it is to question assumptions, to rely on solid evidence, and to guard against the rush to judgment fueled by public hysteria. The case also sparked dialogue about the human cost of wrongful convictions, not just for those imprisoned, but for the victims' families and the community as a whole. It underscored the need for compassion and understanding on all sides, even when the truth is painful and elusive. As Damien, Jason, and Jesse continued their lives beyond prison walls, they carried with them the memories of lost youth, the resilience forged in adversity, and a commitment to truth. Their story remains a haunting reminder of justice denied, a case where the lines between guilt and innocence blur, and the true perpetrators remain unknown. The murders that shocked West Memphis so many years ago continue to echo in the hearts of those left behind, a chilling reminder that sometimes, even the most desperate search for answers can end only in silence. The years that followed the release of Damien Eckel, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miss Kelly Jr. were marked by a restless search for truth, a painful reckoning with the past, and a quiet hope that justice might one day be fully served, not just for the men freed, but for the 3 boys whose lives had been so brutally taken. The community of West Memphis, Arkansas, remained haunted by the tragedy, its scars etched into the memories of those who had lived through the dark days of 1993, and the turbulent years of the wrongful convictions. Conversations about the case took on a weight beyond the facts and the law, reflecting deeper questions about trust, fear, and the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion. For the families of Steve Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael, the journey was painfully complicated. While the release of the West Memphis 3 brought a sense of relief that innocent men were no longer behind bars, it also reopened wounds and stirred uncertainty. The knowledge that the true perpetrator, or perpetrators, remained unidentified, left an unfillable void. No apology, no exoneration, no legal ruling could replace the lives lost or soothe the aching grief of a mother, father, or sibling who never saw their child grow up. Investigators, both official and independent, kept turning over new stones, analyzing the case through fresh lenses. Advances in DNA technology revealed that the biological material found at the scene belonged to someone not in the courtroom, someone who had evaded scrutiny for decades. Yet despite these promising leads, no arrests or new charges ever materialized. The forensic mystery deepened, leaving the case suspended in an uneasy limbo. This ambiguity gave rise to countless theories and speculations. Some suggested the murders were the work of a stranger, a person with dark motives who had never been caught. Others suspected someone from within the community, a figure with hidden secrets and shadowed intentions. These whispers and conjectures often collided with each other, creating a maze of possibilities that only served to deepen the enigma. Damien, Jason, and Jesse each grappled with the unresolved nature of the case in their own way. Damien's writings reflected a profound contemplation of justice, forgiveness, and the lingering pain of being wrongfully accused. He spoke of how the ordeal changed his understanding of humanity and resilience. Jason continued to pursue legal advocacy, working to prevent others from suffering the same fate. Jesse focused on personal healing, finding solace in family and community connections that had endured through the darkest chapters. But even as they rebuilt their lives, the shadow of those 3 young boys, Steve, Christopher, and Michael, never faded. Their brief lives, extinguished so violently, remained the heart of the story. The innocence lost, the laughter silenced, and the futures stolen were a reminder that no legal technicality or plea could fully capture the tragedy's depth. The case also prompted reflection on broader societal issues, how fear and prejudice can distort justice, how communities respond to tragedy, and how the quest for truth is often complicated by human fallibility. The West Memphis 3 story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations, and the importance of maintaining openness to new evidence. In the years following the release, documentaries, books and films brought renewed attention to the case, keeping the story alive in public consciousness. This ongoing interest helped shed light on wrongful convictions nationwide, inspiring reforms and greater scrutiny of law enforcement and prosecutorial conduct. Yet for all the attention and activism, the core mystery remained. The true story of who killed those boys on that summer night in 1993 was still a blank page, a question mark hanging over a community and a nation. Local residents, some wary and others haunted, spoke in hushed tones about what might have happened. Memories blurred, relationships shifted, and the town itself seemed to carry a collective burden. The tragedy had changed West Memphis forever, shaping its identity and its struggles. Some families stayed in West Memphis, holding vigils, erecting memorials, and advocating for justice. Others moved away, seeking distance from the pain. But the imprint of those lost children endured, etched in the quiet moments, the whispered prayers, and the persistent hope that one day, the truth might come to light. For the West Memphis Three, freedom was a complex gift. It brought opportunity and relief, but was inseparable from the trauma and loss they had lived through. The years in prison, the public scrutiny, and the constant question of their innocence or guilt weighed heavily on them. They bore the marks of that time, in their bodies, their minds, and their spirits. The story was far from simple. It was a tapestry woven with grief and hope, injustice and courage, mystery and the relentless pursuit of truth. And in the silence that followed their release, in the space between the unanswered questions, a haunting reality remained sometimes. Justice is partial, the past is unchangeable, and some mysteries may never be fully solved. Yet the legacy of Steve, Christopher, and Michael endures, as does the ongoing fight to ensure that such a tragedy, marked by wrongful accusations, fear and lost lives, never happens again. The West Memphis Three case reminds us all of the fragile nature of justice, and the enduring power of human resilience, even when the darkest chapters refuse to close.